So we're thrilled to have all of you here, and I can share a little bit more about Laurie, who will be joining us for the presentation today. So Laurie drives innovation, strategy, and operations for the Hartman Group, a consultancy focused on identifying demand-side trends in the food and beverage industry. Laurie oversees client projects focused on issues of portfolio management, brand renovation, consumer insights, and innovation. As a nationally recognized authority on consumer behavior and culture, Laurie received her MBA from the University of Washington and her BA from Cornell University. It's great to hear you spent some time on the East Coast, Laurie. I'm not sure if you're from here to begin with, but we are thrilled to have you. I've been a longtime reader of the Hartman Group. Love the content that you produce. I've been getting your newsletter for a long time. Highly recommend anyone listening in on the call to sign up for the newsletter and hear more about the great research and leading really novel work that you're doing at the forefront of food and tracking trends and consumer changes. So we're thrilled to have you. Thank you. And I will hand the floor to you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, so I appreciate the invitation and very happy to speak with all of you virtually. Lauren did a nice job explaining what our organization does. Simply put, we spend a lot of time talking with consumers, going into their homes, looking into their pantries, going on shopping trips with them, and just generally wanting to understand how they're engaging with food and beverage. You know, clearly the last month or two, we've been pursuing some different avenues for doing research. We have been for a long time using some virtual tools, and we've sped up that process significantly. So that we can understand what habits and behaviors are ongoing now, and then make some predictions about what we believe will happen into the future. How many of these things will be short-term, how will be long-lasting, and what that might mean for businesses. So we're engaging in multiple sort of research pathways right now. This is a piece of qualitative research that we just fielded over the last few weeks, where we communicated with a number of consumers across the United States using their mobile phones and smartphones to send us pictures of what they're buying, what's in their cupboards, what they're cooking. And then we did a number of virtual interviews with them as well. So sort of bringing that all together with what we know at a base level about food and beverage culture, and then making some of those predictions. I'm very happy to share this information with anyone who wants it on the back end. I will also say that we like sharing our research very broadly. And so if there are specific things you're interested in or things you think we might have at our beck and call, I'm happy to share those. Feel free to shoot me an email and I will give you what we have off the shelf here. So big picture, just stepping back, we spend a lot of time understanding both what we call culture in the US. So what are our values and beliefs in aggregate, and then the consumer. So at a micro level, what are those beliefs? And so what this continuum shows is what we study from right to left, on the right being just sort of the daily food habits of consumers, all the way to those social cultural trends on the far left. Now, those social cultural trends are big, you know, kind of unmoving things that move very slowly, I should say, or incrementally. So things like what our values and beliefs are as a whole, as a society, where we live, how we work, those things typically don't change very quickly. Culture, ideas, and systems, again, a little bit slow moving. Those are everything from sources of influence to where we get information about food and values. Moving to the middle there, cultural values are things like, you know, what is good tasting food? What do we consider high quality food? What is authentic food? Those things change more often than things on the far left, but there's still sort of a societally shared attitude or set of values. And as we move to the right into needs and contexts and daily food habits, those are much more on that micro level. So those are individuals making decisions about what they eat, when, how, with whom, and those things change pretty readily and pretty rapidly. What we've seen in the past when we've studied traumatic events, and I'll be referencing the 2008 recession because we did a lot of work at that time that I think can be illuminating for what's happening now, albeit a bit different. When a traumatic event happens, there's impact on all of these forces. Now, we don't believe things on the far left there, these kind of base beliefs about what it is to live in America today are likely to change, but there's a lot that's likely to change on the right there. So some of the habits that consumers are undertaking today in terms of meal prep and cooking and what good food means, we think are likely to be subject to some long-term change because of what's happening with the pandemic. Needs and context is something that's a little more static, but we also think that's going to be impacted. And as we look back to last recession, we didn't really necessarily change those needs and context. It was more the little things around price and value and what that meant. But because today's pandemic incorporates other elements that will go beyond a recessionary environment, so things like socialization, what we call commensality, meaning eating and sharing food with others, we think some of those things are going to see some long-term change. And we even think as we move to the left into that cultural values space, there might be some lasting change around what is good food? What does a responsible food company look like? How should our food supply change given that this crisis seems to impact it in ways we didn't anticipate? So unlike the last recession, we believe that many of the changes we see today are not just going to be on that individual level on the right, but moving towards that more societal level that's in the middle there. And so some lasting impactful change. Now, shopping, and I'm going to go kind of briefly here through shopping, eating, and nutrition. Shopping clearly, I mean, we're all experiencing this, so no surprise, we're shopping differently. And you can see some numbers that just came out of some recent work we did with FMI there in terms of people saying, absolutely, things have changed with regard to my shopping. And that typically is shopping at fewer stores, shopping more quickly, a lot of people going online for the first time. We think that would, it's artificially repressed because there's so many people who actually can't even get an online order placed just because of the demand. So we think that's going to continue to grow and change. And on the left there, what we're seeing are signs of something that we typically call the stock up trip. And that's actually been on steep decline in society up until this point, meaning that Americans as a whole were starting to shop more stores more often because we bought different things at different places. Pre-pandemic, we found that 50% of all shopping trips, what a consumer would describe as a shopping trip, were to 2 or more stores. And so we were really, as a society, starting to go get our fresh things at one place, maybe all the things we loved, those special snacks at Trader Joe's. And so we went to a natural food store for the fresh, Trader Joe's for some of the frozen fun stuff, and then a mainstream grocery store for a lot of our packaged and goods that were in center store. Now, what we're starting to see is a retreat back to more of this stock up behavior. Now, how long that lasts is the question, because I think it's most likely from what we're hearing that we're going to be in a recessionary environment before too long. When that happens, people become obviously much more focused on price. And what they tend to do is go shop on price, and they tend to go to more stores to find the best deals at each store. So it'll be interesting to see, and we don't necessarily have a POV on yet because it really depends on how quickly we can go back to shopping multiple channels and how hard hit we are by potential recession to really figure out how this is impacted. Our belief at the Hartman Group, however, is that stock up trips will probably continue to go back into decline once we're out of this situation, that people really have embraced this idea of shopping different places for different things and going to specialty stores for specialty things. But that really remains to be seen in terms of how hard hit we are by the economic reality. Now, in terms of what we're doing at home, again, a couple things on this list aren't too surprising. We're eating a lot more meals at home now. We're not on the move as much. Food service, which has really been a way that we've outsourced a lot of our food prep over the last decade, is no longer an option in many cases. And household responsibilities are shifting. And we heard that again and again from the consumers we talked to, that people who hadn't necessarily been in charge of meal prep before were now in charge. Obviously, with multiple folks trying to work from home, school their kids from home, there's just new routines across the board. And so what that's already done is really change this meaning of convenience to consumers, which was on a long-term, kind of shifting landscape anyway. So looking at the bottom left here, convenience traditionally, right, going back 10 plus years ago, when consumers would talk about convenience as it related to food, they'd say, well, it needs to be easy, quick, and accessible, sort of those basic building blocks of convenience. What we've seen over the past decade is this idea of modern convenience, and it's not that we left things that were easy, quick, and accessible, it's just that we layered in more needs onto those other elements. So for example, empowerment, which meant maybe I don't want to get a meal that's totally prepared. I want to get a meal that's sort of partially prepared and I can bring my own creativity and customization to it. So let someone else be the sous chef and do all that hard work, the marinade for the steak or the chopping of the vegetables. And then I'll just give it my own special sort of unique twist when I get it home. So there was still this desire to have some sort of role in that food prep, just nothing too difficult. Engaging. And what that meant for many consumers is I'm interested in food. I want to know more about it. I want to learn how to cook global foods or cook something different. And so it wasn't just about quickness, although that was still important. It was also that maybe I would learn something or I'd try something new. So maybe I'm not going to make that really amazing Indian meal I ate out at the restaurant from scratch. I'm going to buy a kit, but I'm still going to do a little bit of the work so that I can learn out more about that food culture. And then flexible, which in the last 10 years has taken on this meaning of fitting to the occasion. And what we mean by that is that consumers' eating occasions have changed dramatically. Pre-COVID, 50% of all eating occasions were done alone. No matter if we lived in a big household, small household, there was just a lot of alone eating, not just snacks, but meals. Another, when you look across the board, there's a cut between meals and snacks. 50% of all eating occasions were snacks and 50% were meals. So we've really become a nation of snackers and doing a lot of snacking throughout the day. And so we've had to seek these more flexible foods and beverages that fit this unique set of occasions that we're now engaging in. Now, those things, those modern ideas of convenience have not been bypassed in the past couple of weeks, but what we're seeing is there's some new elements of what they mean for consumers today, and that's what you can see on the lower right there. So this idea of empowerment, so giving a sense of control and accomplishment along with that engagement. Engaging, meaning we have a little more time now. So we're finding for many consumers, they're putting some of that time into cooking and trying new techniques or things that they maybe wouldn't have tried in the past because they didn't have that time or they had too much else on their mind. And then flexibility is not just about these eating occasions that we've gone through and changed in terms of our habits and behaviors, but being more versatile and adaptable. So that idea of kind of using what's off the shelf. So this is simply to say that convenience by no stretch of the imagination is something consumers aren't thinking about today. It's just that it has new elements. And from a marketing or communications perspective, you might want to think about how your products can meet those needs in terms of empowerment, engagement, and flexibility, both during this short period of time and also in the long term as well. Now, when it comes to cooking, what we found were two very sort of clear and discrete buckets in terms of how consumers have been approaching cooking. Most of it being very what we call improvised, because for many of them on the bottom left there, there's this sort of sense that I don't really want to be spending a lot of time cooking. It's really difficult for me. And by the way, I'm just worried about not having enough food or using everything on my shelf. And so it was this sense of kind of just throwing things together because they were available or they were going to go bad. And so that's sort of one camp of consumers. Another camp of consumers on the bottom right there, and I'd say it was a smaller camp, frankly, was spending just more time cooking. Like it was actually an embrace of having that time and being able to get to have a bit more fun, do some entertainment with cooking, doing some special treats or things they would have made in the past, trying out new recipes or recipes that were part of the family history that they've never had time to do. So again, from a marketing and communications approach, I think in this time of kind of forced adaptation, to be cognizant and recognize that and be empathetic to your consumer needs if you're talking to them during this time about what they're struggling with, especially as it relates to cooking. Nutrition never falls by the wayside. Nutrition certainly is top of mind for consumers, but they've definitely made some trade-offs in terms of how I think about nutrition. For the past decade or so, for most consumers, sort of the ultimate definition of nutrition was fresh, real, and less processed foods. And we're in a time right now where fresh, real, less processed foods aren't as easy to access. They don't keep as long. And so consumers are in the short term making some trade-offs there. So they sort of have this hierarchy they're still using, which at the top there is saying that I still want to have these nutritious foods, but they're not necessarily going to be fresh produce, fresh meat, fresh dairy. A lot of it's going to be frozen. And there is this sense now that what they're really seeking is nutrient density. So for example, I'm willing to give up maybe low calorie if I can get high protein. So that high protein is going to come up high calorie, and that's okay for the time being. So that's sort of the top of the hierarchy, is that kind of still nutritious, but maybe pulling back a bit from fresh, real, less processed. You can see in the middle there, we also see a trade-off consumers are making is that they're not necessarily putting together a sort of meal as they typically would in the past. And I love this example of someone who said that they had some pasta and frozen veggies, but they realized they needed some protein and they didn't have any fresh protein, so they did a protein shake because they're still now putting together those nutritional building blocks, even though it was sort of an odd mix. And then we've also heard quite a bit, and this is especially from parents or folks who are maybe taking care of their parents, is looking for things that had some satiety. Energy and satiety has been a long-term shift in how consumers think about food consumption. Energy in many cases in their minds is laddering up to performance, not just physical performance, but mental performance, social performance, being a good spouse, parent, etc. And so this idea of keeping their children and themselves full is sort of the building block of this. So if we can't have sort of the top of that, the nutritious, long-lasting foods, at least they're going to eat something and it's going to keep them full for a while. And then kind of looking out ahead, one of the things that we have found from a lot of consumers is this sort of declining faith in general in terms of governments and large corporations. And this is not new. We did a study last year on sustainability, one that we've been doing for quite a while and updating. And there were three things real quick that came out of that I think are really impactful. Number one, we found that the youngest consumers, the Gen Z consumers, so the folks who are under 22 years of age, were actually the most pessimistic about the future of our planet compared to all age categories. Typically, we see the youngest consumers being the most optimistic. They were the least optimistic. Number two, what we found is there's a huge amount of distrust pre-COVID in government, elected officials, and businesses. 75% of Americans said they had little to no trust in elected officials. 60% said they had little to no trust in business leaders. And so we've got these declining authority figures. And then thirdly, what we found last year is that the number one health condition that consumers were worried about, which for 20 years had been weight management, has suddenly become stress and anxiety. So even pre-COVID, what we saw is stress and anxiety being the number one things that consumers were concerned with across the board. Now, what's happened in light of the recent crisis is those things have all just gone up exponentially. Stress and anxiety, obviously, mistrust, and now there's new layers of it that you can see here. So questioning things like food justice, who has access to food. Shouldn't the food distribution system be more adaptable? So concerns there, questions about abundance. And I think what they feel like they can change is maybe their own practices and behaviors around food sourcing. And so thinking now, being more thoughtful about where they're sourcing their food from. The report that's coming out, one of the number one things we found is this increasing reliance on local food systems. So a very strong consumer belief that local food systems is going to be a part of the future, not just because there's a feel-good piece of that, which has always been around, but because they see it as a more sustainable and a more trustworthy way to access food moving ahead. So we think that's going to be a big, long-lasting change coming out of this. And then finally, I wanted to just look back to the 2008 recession. We did, this is actually a slide, is from a report we did over 10 years ago. You can see the pictures look a little bit old there. And I think these are some good insights for today as we think about what's going to happen to food businesses. I think there is no doubt that there is going to be long-term change in terms of how consumers are thinking about food and the role it plays in their lives, given how important food is as a part of this crisis. So as we look at these themes, I would ask you all to think about, where does your business fit into these? On the far left, the first theme we found after the recession is that consumers basically just opted out of some categories that didn't have any sort of relevance to their lives anymore. And so they were thoughtful about what products maybe didn't really play a role. They were nostalgic. There were things that were feel good, but they definitely weren't meeting all their needs. Number two theme, we saw a lot of consumers trade down, especially into private label products. And so in categories where they didn't see the national brand as having a distinction about it, they were very much willing to move into private label. And there's no doubt the last 10 years have shown huge growth of private label. And as a reminder, private label today really isn't just about the lowest price point. In many cases, many retailers have premium private label. So there's a tiered structure. So consumers are buying into even the premium private label space. And then finally, what we found on the far right is that those categories during the recession that were associated with premium delivering, experiences and high quality products held up remarkably well. Natural organic held up remarkably well. Some of the sustainable foods held up remarkably well. So I think as a business, thinking about, do you fit into that premium space? We do not think that's going to go away. It did not go away in the past, it won't in the future. So really thinking about these three themes and seeing how you might fit in. I do believe that we're going to see long-term change in how consumers think about national food supplies versus local food supplies, and that will be a lasting change. And secondly, this sort of continuum of value products on the one hand and premium on the other, I think we're going to see even more movement towards one of those ends of the spectrum on the part of consumers. So being thoughtful about what end of the spectrum your products and your services live on. So with that, I'd be delighted to take questions if there are any.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laurie. Excellent presentation. So we'll open it up for questions from the group at this time. If you've got a question and you'd like to ask, feel free to unmute yourself, or you can send the question through chat and we can do the voiceover for you. So if anyone has a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask at this time. So one of the questions that we have coming through the chat, Laurie, is a little bit about the differentiations between brands. So, thinking about big, more legacy brands that, have traditionally created more comfort food products, it seems like that's really been what consumers have been gravitating towards. Are you seeing any adoption of new brands, and our consumers, I guess in some ways we think about it as being exploratory or interested in discovery of new products? Have you looked at any comparisons between those legacy brands and kind of new brands that are coming on shelf, and what consumers' interest may be in both at this time?
Certainly. So and we're starting to do this in the more, the larger, the quantitative study we're doing. But again, going back to what we've seen in the past for learnings, because I think they're relevant today, in the time of immediate crisis, which I would say we are still in, I think we're finding, number one, retailers being less open to bringing new products on the shelves. They're just trying to like kind of get through day to day. So I think one problem is just the access. If you're going through traditional retail channels, a bit more challenging, different if you're going online. And number two, I think we're still in that time period where consumers are sort of stockpiling and just kind of trying to steady themselves. What we saw in the past in situations like this is, coming out of that, food was a real, a really important way that they could start to embrace, things outside of the norm. It was a way of discovery and experience, of feeling like you're making good choices. And I think we'll see the same thing here. So I think, and I don't know if that's a couple of weeks or a couple of months, but I think what we saw in the past was that sense of wanting to take good care of my family's health and no longer be eating all those comfort foods was very strong. I don't think we're going back to name names, but I think a lot of comfort foods consumers are using now. It's a very short-term bleep they're going to see, and I think they're aware of that. But number two, many of these smaller brands have great narratives and stories and origins, and I think that's a way that consumers can express some of this sort of coming out of the cocoon and experiencing new things. So I think even though times right now are difficult because of the way consumers behaving, this is going to be something that is going to be actually an embrace of new brands and new experiences and new narratives coming out of the other side of it. We just don't know exactly when that will be.
Great. So another question that came in, do you think there will be a huge market for pre-cooked food in the future? And what has, I guess, past research indicated about what is to come?
Yes. So I think what we're going to see, and this is no different than what we saw beforehand, is that consumers didn't necessarily want to make, obviously, everything from scratch, but nor did they want to make, buy something that was totally prepared already. There's a time and a place for that. But we saw with a lot of consumers was that they wanted to kind of meet somewhere in between. And so we almost tried, we talk about as like meal components. So they would maybe get something that was totally done, like the meat was already totally cooked and ready and perfect, right? But they would be choosing maybe some veggies or some spices to do with it. So the sense of meal components and structuring a meal around differing levels of engagement, we think will likely to be continued. I do want to note too, we continue to see, pre-COVID, all this sort of these ideas that millennials, for example, don't like to cook. We found extremely high engagement with cooking on the part of millennial consumers. It's just that many of them didn't necessarily feel like they had the tools, the space, the wherewithal to do it yet. So, super high levels, like 70% saying they like to experiment with cooking. 70% want to learn more about cooking. Compare that to boomers who are kind of like, they're over it. They're done with cooking. So I think that in order to meet needs of consumers, especially those who are developing families and building the blocks of what food looks like in their household moving ahead, there's a place for totally prepared, but I think we've got to be cognizant that they still want to do some of that kind of customization and creativity. So this, I think about as meal components, what you can provide to them and what they're likely to still do at home is what we're going to see moving into the future as well.
Great answer. We have some more questions coming through the chat, including questions on meal kits. It seems like some of us have been following for sure the Blue Apron stock price, which I think very quickly once we started entering kind of quarantine and staying at home went up to $25 a share. Previously, they were, I believe, below $1. So what are you seeing in terms of meal kits, and do they satisfy some of these consumer trends that will be more long-term as opposed to less coming out of COVID?
Yep. Certainly. So pre-COVID, we had already predicted about 2 or 3 years ago that we believe meal kits were absolutely part of the American cooking routine moving ahead. But the sea change that was going on is they were moving from distribution via order online, sent to your home, to retail. And there's a number of reasons for that, primarily because people don't make decisions about what they're going to eat in advance. And so for many people, they're finding those meal kits weren't delivering on what they wanted that particular night when they got home, yet there it was in their house. going to a retail environment where they can still choose which meal kit they want made a lot more sense to them. And it's really much more an embrace of how we decide to eat. 60% of everything we decide to eat with regard to dinner even is decided within an hour of dinner because we want to eat what we feel like. So what we were seeing was that, and I'd say there's some other issues there too, like sustainability. People were certain people, just given all the waste that comes with food delivery to your home of a meal kit, they were finding problematic. Some of that retailers were being able to skirt around by distributing them in different ways. So what we had seen pre-COVID is a embrace of the meal kit, but an embrace of a meal kit at retail rather than something that was being delivered to your home, unless you had a really specific diet or need. Now, obviously, people aren't wanting to spend as much time in retail right now, so it's no surprise we've seen this return to more online meal kit. Once people feel comfortable going back to stores, we think that meal kits will be a very relevant offering, but primarily within that retail environment where you can decide last minute to pick it up on the way home because suddenly you think, wow, I actually have an hour to make a dinner, but I want to make it really easy on myself. And they have more choice in terms of what meal kit they're deciding to bring home with them.
Great. And building on that, as you think about meal kit and home delivery versus kind of retail, maybe extrapolating beyond just meal kits, any indicators of whether folks will choose to get more at-home delivery from their preferred retailers, or do we anticipate more and more people will be comfortable enough to go back into the store?
Well, I think it's no doubt that there's many more people who are now going to feel comfortable using online than did before. So I think that certainly, it's been something, from a sort of an industry press standpoint, everyone talks about online, but it was such a small part of the overall food industry. There's no doubt this is going to help that move up. Will it be 10%, 20, 30? Probably somewhere between that, and which is a big change from what it was before. I think the other thing that's definitely changing is the role of food service. And I think that those food service providers who have been really innovative about getting meals to consumers, whether they're doing delivery or setting up a table in front of the restaurant to serve, to Panera Bread, who's now doing groceries, you can buy groceries from them. I think there's no doubt that food service is going to play a very different role in consumer diets and become a much more normalized part of it. And I think to the extent that they're even combining what they're getting out of food service with doing some cooking at home, so sort of mix and matching, we're going to see that as well. So there is a lasting impact where we're going to see, I think, online and food service go up. It's not going to take over retail because people, especially with regard to fresh, right, produce, meat, dairy, still like being the one who's making those decisions. But for many of those other kind of canned goods, packaged goods, things you can buy anywhere, the exact same thing, I think we're going to see a huge influx of people utilizing online, as well as integrating more food service into their at-home eating.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. Well, any other questions from the group? I know we certainly do have some via chat, but I did want to give an opportunity for people to unmute themselves again and jump in. I can keep going.
If you're able to share the deck.
Oh, yes, of course. We will make this recording available on our YouTube channel. But if you'd like the deck as well, just shoot us an email at info@branchfood.com and we're happy to share it directly.
Thank you.
Great. Laurie, any insight on the topic of farmers markets? A lot of the folks that we work with, early stage companies, really rely on farmers markets for consumer connection and sales. And so, any indicators about farmers markets going forward and what we can expect for maybe not the reopening of them, but just consumer engagement around them?
Yeah, obviously, as everyone is well aware, we are social animals. And I think especially when it comes to food and the stories behind food and the narratives, there is something that is innately appealing long-term about the interaction that happens at farmers markets. It's really interesting you mentioned that because I was surprised to learn that I live here in an area called Ballard outside of Seattle, and our farmers market's reopening this weekend. There are a lot of very strict rules. And in fact, you have to, on a Google, you've got to sign an oath of how you're going to act when you're in the farmer's market in terms of distancing. And, there's a lot of regulations about it. But we have been, Seattle of all places, been on total lockdown. So I was really surprised, but it made me think, number one, to support the producers there, which I think is a really strong driver in our community. And number two, I think there's that sense of social engagement around food, which is so important to us as humans, right? It's something we all share. And I think the impact of those farmers markets in terms of narratives around how food is grown and made and support, that is not going away. And in fact, that's being heightened by what we're seeing now. Many consumers told us, I've really thought about where my food, mainstream consumers don't really talk about where my food came from or the people behind it. And the fact that they're still getting this food to me in this environment is amazing. So I think we're going to see even more sense of wanting that engagement and that commensality around food. And certainly it'll be interesting to see at what pace the farmers markets can come back into being. And we'll have a little experiment going on in our neck of the woods this weekend.